Okay, thanks very much. Welcome to everybody. This afternoon then, I really want to just run through, I know we've titled it Pupil Data Stories, but really I want to start by sort of setting the context for where we are with this. So if I just move on to this slide. Myself and others have been doing a lot of work with schools post Life After Levels, and we've developed a model here at GL to support the kind of work, the kind of assessment framework that schools very well may be designing for themselves in-house. We've had a couple of goes, as you can see, on kind of visual representation of that. But it doesn't really matter how we represent it. The idea is that following Life After Levels, there is, we can say whatever we like about the perhaps lack of information regarding the future level structure, but certainly the removal of the old system does allow a greater freedom for schools to develop their own in-house assessment framework for the benefit of their students. And we believe that we can support any model that's designed in that way by bringing something different and extra to the table that schools can't for themselves do. And that is in the way of national benchmarking or normative data. Any system that's developed in-house will, by necessity, be looking at everyday assessment, slightly longer term assessment, but very much based around, quite rightly, formative assessment, looking at individual students, pupils, and seeing where what they can and they can't do, their strengths and weaknesses, and filling those gaps and moving individual students on. And we see that as vital as the government does in its guidance in setting up new systems. It's actually number one on their list, showing that they also view that this kind of assessment is vital. We, however, believe that alongside that, there will be a need for more normative data, for more data that looks perhaps at a comparison of pupil-student performance outside of the school, between schools, and across the whole country. And we believe that's where we can help schools, not supplant the information that they're getting within schools, but to complement it. And the model we've designed, as I say, brings that normative data to the equation, but also, we believe, looks at these key areas, looks at current attainment, looks at the performance levels as are now of students and individuals, and gets that national benchmarked view. But also, we want to take that opportunity to look outside of day-to-day current performance and look at what could be, to look at ability measures which might give us an indication of hidden performance, hidden potential to actually achieve at a much higher level than children are currently doing so. In this model, it's very straightforward process using standardized age scores which represent that national benchmarking to actually do a very simple comparison between performance levels in attainment and ability levels looking outside of current performance. Where there is a discrepancy, where there is a mismatch, it's very easy to see that could very well be hidden potential, or perhaps better put, underachievement. Where that potential underachievement lies, we can also help in identifying what those barriers to learning are. It makes common sense that if we have the ability to perform at a higher level but are not currently doing so, there must be a reason for that. There must be a barrier to learning. So simply identifying underachievement is a long way down the road, but it's not the destination. So we have a number of assessments that help us do that. Now, often just talking in this abstract way about, we could look at the particular assessments and we have assessments that in combination can help you do this, it's all a little bit too vague and undefined. And that's why we've actually come up with these data stories, as we're calling them. And today I want to look at two in particular. These are not case studies. These are pieces of data. These are example data from our assessments that have been put together to illustrate a particular way that these assessment data could be combined to give us an all-round view, as it were. They're not meant to be viewed as templates. If you see these numbers within your data that you get from GL, it means necessarily this. I want to make it absolutely clear that we're actually taking this data to illustrate more the model and how that data can be used in combination, and perhaps to show how the power of assessments really is only unleashed when we do look at them in combination. Anyway, so let's have a look at one of these stories. This story is about Victoria Thomas. Here we can see a CAT, Cognitive Abilities Test, data report. Now, the CAT test is a test of ability. So this is us looking at really a person's ability to perform in various subjects across the board in the absence of looking at particular learning barriers at this stage. And I don't know whether you can make out, but Victoria Thomas is about 2/3 the way through that list, and we can see her standardized scores. I'm not really explaining standardized scores much in this presentation, except to say that 100 would be the national average, and scores as Victoria's got here in the 4 parts of the cognitive abilities test, the verbal reasoning, the quantitative reasoning, the non-verbal reasoning, and the spatial reasoning, are all pretty much around 111, 112, 114, that sort of level. And just for those of you that are more unfamiliar with standardized scores, those kind of scores would put Victoria in the top 20% of the population in terms of ability. In this report, it also gives a GR, which is simply group rank. So within her group within the school, which is a group of 60 students, she's approximately 9th in that group. Just gives you a little idea not only of a national benchmark, but also of a benchmark within the school. Those scores are pretty consistent, so it wouldn't suggest that she has a particular cognitive strength or weakness in any of the 4 parts that make up the CAT. Those 4 parts really represent all the ways that we take on information in our daily lives, by word, by number, by shape, and by actually the 3-dimensional manipulation of shapes, which is spatial. Within the CAT report, we also produce what's called a learning bias scattergraph. This scattergraph here is between verbal and spatial, representing the 2 sort of extremes, if you like, of ways of taking on new information. And as much as we saw in the previous report, those scores seem to indicate that there isn't a particular bias either towards verbal or spatial. And we can see visually that that score, because it's off towards the right-hand side, is high, and further is the top 20% of students. So if I was just looking at this assessment in isolation, I would know that the student had little bias in the way that they assimilated information, and there wouldn't be too many concerns about curriculum delivery being a barrier to learning. And I'd also be having the expectation that her performance was high, because top 20% in ability, that should be reflected in performance if there were no other considerations. Here you can see on the screen a report back from the Pupil Attitude to Self and School. This is an assessment we do that gives an idea of, well, it's self-reported by the student, but is a psychometric measure that actually gives percentile scores, so it is reference to a national sample in terms of how the student, the pupil, thinks about their learning within school. And it is very closely tied to learning and is, as you can see there, not anonymous, so that we can put alongside an individual's scores in ability and in this attitude together. And for Victoria, I don't know quite whether you can see the numbers, but if I just read a few of them out, in terms of her self-regard as a learner and in her preparation, how well she feels she's been prepared for learning within the classroom, her scores in that preparedness for learning are in the bottom 5% of the population. And her self-regard as a learner, her current and former learning experience, puts her in the bottom 20% of the population. So now these two reports put together are clearly showing that there's a mismatch. Her ability levels are high, but her regard as a learner is very, very low. And as the annotation there suggests, is that bringing down response to curriculum, how well she integrates with the work that's being presented? Is that being brought down, or is the fact that perhaps she's struggling in how she feels she's struggling to actually interact with the work is bringing down her self-regard in terms of her learning? If we start looking at actual performance or attainment measures, this is a measure of attainment in maths. Here we see Victoria's scores now around 113, which is quite similar to the CAT scores. In other words, the performance level here in that national benchmark is of the same order of the CAT. So here, her performance in maths is a reflection of her ability, as suggested by the CAT. We can see that her score in algebra is considerably lower, so we are getting maths detail. But in terms of that story, I can't believe that simply a relatively low score in one area of maths is affecting her self-regard in terms of her learning in such a serious way. If we go on and look at her progress in English, which is an attainment measure, but at this time specifically in English, we can see here, because she's about just over halfway down that list, her standardized score in English is 101. This is very close to the national average. So although national average performance is nothing wrong, but in a girl that could be performing around the top 20%, this is obviously a cause for concern. Some of those scores are very low indeed. So it could be that perhaps what is at the root of her lack of self-belief in her learning perhaps could be literacy related. If we look a little more deeply, this is a test that we look at in terms of performance specifically around reading capability. Here we can see that Victoria's scores are really depressed in this area. This report allows us to see a reading age, a standardized score, which in this case now is putting her in the below average range. We can also see a separate score for sentence completion and passage comprehension. Sentence completion looks at the kind of mechanism of reading, and passage comprehension looks more at understanding of reading. So looking at a comparison there, we can see that actually when helped to mechanistically read the passage, her understanding is good, but her decoding of that information is poor. Now in the annotation you can see on the screen, it looks like the teacher is suggesting that there could be a problem with dyslexia. I wouldn't want to make that jump at this stage, but certainly as an indication, that could be something that would be very much worth following up in terms of more specific one-to-one diagnostic assessment. So that's how I think we've shown that data coming from a number of assessments, but going round, if you think back to that initial model, going round the model of looking at what could be, what is, and investigating possible learning barriers, illustrates how much more powerful in combination that data is. In fact, just in a few slides that follow, we've also used that kind of model to suggest if we were able to address that particular learning barrier, how it might be reflected in the kind of progress reports that are available for those assessments. This is a PASS resurveyed, so here we're showing that PASS could easily be used to look at pre and post intervention. Here we can see that the scores in the areas that were previously depressed have made improvement. Of course, if that weren't the case, we'd be able to see that the intervention that we used was of less value. This is a progress report from the maths assessment where we were able to actually plot, if you like, all the students' progress from one assessment to another, in this case usually yearly, but it could be pre and post intervention. We can see that in this case the individual students lie within that sort of middle tramway position, which is within the middle 70% of the population's expected progress. So here we can see that Victoria is making a full year's progress, even though she was already at quite a high level within maths. Within English, she was at a slightly beginning lower level in terms of performance, but even so we can see a full year's worth of progress has been made following successful intervention. And lastly, I believe, looking specifically at her reading, we can see that following interventions that we have actually improved her performance. It's still not perhaps where it should be, but you know, you can't do everything immediately. Again, these are really just illustrative of the model to show how the data can be used to give that all-round view. And just to sort of follow that up, if we just look at another example, remember, I'm just going to repeat it, this is not a case study. This data has been created to illustrate how the reports can be used in combination rather than trying to provide a template to spot a particular problem. I'm just going to go through a very similar process, starting with Sarah's cognitive abilities test. She's right at the top of that list, and we can see this time the scores are 130 in verbal reasoning, 120 quantitative, 119 non-verbal, 126 in spatial reasoning. So there, a particular strength, if you like, in verbal reasoning, but all those scores are very high, and those scores are going to be putting people in the top 5%, top 10%, shall we say, at the very lowest of those figures, up to the top 5% of the population. So could be considered in terms of possible outperforming of other colleagues in the school as a potential gifted and talented student. Again, that test in isolation. I think there's a question come up at screen. If you don't mind just for a moment, though, I will keep a note of that question and come back to it at the end. So that's the bias scatter graph here, and we can see once again that there is no particular bias between spatial and verbal, so probably Sarah would be equally skilled at gaining information from a number of different ways of assimilating and problem solving. But again, you can see very clearly that that's a very high score. With CAT, a report we didn't look at before is one that can be produced for individual students, but for their teachers. Here, it's possible to come up with some implications for teaching and learning. We worked with a number of head teachers and representatives from education to come up with possible implications for teaching and learning linked to specific biases and performance levels in ability. And here we're illustrating how it would be possible for a teacher to go through this and look for key points. Here the teachers underlined it would be good to check that expectations are appropriately high, to check that fast pace of instruction was going on, that Sarah was likely to be self-motivated and independent learner, and making little notes to check would there be enough opportunities for this within the way that she was taught. Also, you can see in the little post-it note that there is a report there from her teachers. Sarah's teachers are actually reporting, though, that apart from her rather than her demonstrating this independent learning and a need for fast instruction, she appears somewhat turned off in lessons and is not performing near her ability level. And finally, even reporting that there have been problems in terms of behaviour. However, it doesn't seem to be reflected in terms of attendance. It could very well be that if you look at those two together, it might be the fact that perhaps if there isn't enough opportunity for fast-paced instruction, for independent learning and so on, that she could easily be turned off simply because she's under-challenged. If we have a look at her past profile, and it's just almost level with the top of that post-it, we can again see, like the last example, that this student, Sarah in this case, has a very low bottom 5% percentile response in terms of herself as a learner and in her preparedness for being able to get on with the learning in the classroom. We can also see that in terms of confidence in learning and response to the curriculum, very low scores as well. This is a student who would appear to be losing faith with what's being taught in school. Although, if you look next to it, in terms of attitude to attendance, she does seem still committed to coming to school. If we have a look at the attainment sort reports now, you can see Sarah is towards the bottom of that list, and in terms of performance, well below what might be expected from her CAT ability scores, and in fact at the bottom end of average performance. In fact, many of the areas covered by the maths, number, shape, space, data handling, are all very, very low. Is it different in English? Not appreciably. Again, her performance level standardized score, which allows that comparison between assessments to be made, is at the low end of average. Again, there seems to be across the board low performance, and certainly nowhere near a reflection of ability. Here we've got the new group reading test, which we can use both as a kind of attainment measure, if you like, for tracking, but also as a way of looking to see potential barriers to learning. Performance level, well, actually slightly higher than we've seen in the curriculum areas, but more around the average level, which again is some, in terms of standardized scores from the CAT, way adrift. Roughly equal performance in both decoding and understanding, but adrift from the verbal reasoning score that we saw in the CAT assessment. And just to sort of complete the story here, as it were, it would appear from the evidence that we presented here that the problems probably are reflected in terms of Sarah's performance levels in school, but perhaps are not originating within school because she still feels connected with school and wants to come to school. It might suggest that problems are actually occurring outside of school. It's not saying, oh, this is the specific problem, but it's certainly very, very useful in seeing where those problems do lie. In terms of this illustrative story, that's what we've gone with. We've gone with the idea that these problems are perhaps out of school, and that and they're not all very easily addressed always, but let's say having had those flagged up at least, that we were able to look at how we might address those problems together with Sarah. We can then, like in the last example, resurvey and check to see if what we're doing actually works. And in this report, this illustrative report, that's what we're showing. And you might expect, as we're showing in these reports, that if we can do something about problems that were previously totally hidden and invisible, those kind of changes could very, very easily be reflected and picked up in these progress reports that we're able to run within attainment. There we've got a progress in maths, progress chart, and in fact her plotted improvement from one year to another is actually above the national improvement level or expected progress level. And that it wouldn't be unexpected if there were problems out of school that we could address successfully. And similarly, you can see in progress in English. But it's really trying to illustrate that these standardized scores allow us to look at cross-assessments, but also to look at progress year to year and benchmark it to a national sample. And just completing the picture, if that new group reading test is run again, we can provide that data side by side so we can look at the effectiveness of interventions and look to see what could be put into place that might work better, or to see if what we're doing actually looks like it is working. Okay, so without going into too much detail on what those assessments, the features, as I say, of those assessments, just looking at the reporting, I think it's very clear to see that how they come together to paint this really 360-degree view of students and how it might fit within a wider assessment package that is looking at day-to-day and formative assessment, but complemented with looking at summative and normative data to support.